Hi guys, welcome to another Redhead Stokey podcast. My name's Jenna Goodwin, and this time we're going to be talking about a medieval priory that's hidden underneath stone in Staffordshire. We've all walked past an old building and thought, I wonder what used to be there. And that's it, isn't it? That one passing thought. It might come to you in a car park, or on a high street, or even just while staring at a weird wall that doesn't quite match the rest of the street. And most of the time we never get an answer. We don't stop, we don't ask, we keep walking. But in Stone, Staffordshire, if you ask that question, what used to be here, you might just end up standing above a 1300-year-old secret. Right beneath the house, a perfectly normal-looking Georgian house, lies a piece of history that survived kings, wars, religion, politics, and supermarkets. And it's not just a story, it's a mystery, a legend, and for a long time it was completely forgotten. So I'm going to take you back, not just through the streets of Stone, but through 1300 years of power, tragedy, grief, treasure, and rediscovery. Let's go back to the 7th century, around 670 AD. This was long before England was a single country. Back then, Britain was a patchwork of kingdoms. Mercia, Kent, Northumbria, East Anglia. Each had its own ruler, its own laws, and its own way of doing things. One of these kings was Wulfhere of Mercia. He ruled from 658 to 675, and like many rulers of that time, he was navigating a world in transition, especially when it came to religion. Because he wasn't born a Christian, he was born pagan, and like most people in that part of the world then, he at some point converted to Christianity, mainly to secure an alliance through marriage. His wife, Queen Ormenhill, was from Kent, a kingdom that had already embraced the new religion. But for the king, converting wasn't just about belief, it was about politics. Christianity offered more than just a new way to pray. It came with diplomatic benefits, it meant aligning with other Christian rulers, and it meant influence. But his relationship with Christianity didn't last, and at some point he returned to paganism. Maybe out of conviction, maybe out of convenience, but either way it created a divide. Because him and his wife had 2 sons, Wulfad and Rufin. The boys grew up in a kingdom where belief was becoming a serious issue, and according to legend they became interested in Christianity, perhaps more genuinely than the father ever was. Now this is where the part of the story moves into legend, but it's a legend that's been told in this area for over 1,000 years. One day the boys went out hunting, and while they were in the forest they saw a white stag, which is a rare animal even in stories. And in British and European folklore, a white stag isn't just an animal. It usually means a journey is about to begin, or a turning point. The story goes that the stag led the boys to a quiet place, where they met St. Chad, the Bishop of Lichfield, who was a real historical figure who helped spread Christianity throughout Mercia. And there, in the woods, the boys were baptised. It should have been a hopeful moment, 2 young men making a personal choice, choosing a faith that meant something to them. But when King Wulfhere found out, he didn't see it that way, he saw it as betrayal. He'd turned away from Christianity, and now his own sons had chosen it. And it was because of this that Wulfhere killed them. Not in battle, not in anger during an argument, but deliberately, with a sword, for their faith. And after the deaths, the queen was left to deal with the aftermath. And what she did is buried her sons in line with Saxon tradition, under large stones. No elaborate tombs, no grand monuments, she just marked stones over their graves. And then she built a church on that spot. A church dedicated to her sons and to St. Mary. That church was the beginning of Stone Priory, and it was around that church that a town slowly grew. And the name of that place? Stone. Not poetic, not symbolic, just stone, because of the stones that were laid over the graves of the 2 young boys. And that's it, that's the origin for the town. It's not just a name, it's a reference to what happened there. And it is easy to forget that walking around the town today. Most people probably don't think twice about the name, it's just where they live, on the signs, the road maps, the council letters. But the truth is, the town is built on a very old, sad story. But that's only the beginning of the story. The original church that the Queen built in about 670 AD didn't survive, and at some point, probably in the 9th century, it was destroyed by Viking raiders. They were targeting monasteries and churches across England at the time, not because they were anti-religion, but just that was where the money was. And monasteries were easy targets, full of gold, books, wine, food, and they didn't exactly have armies guarding them. It's very likely that Stone Priory was caught up in these raids, and like many places from that time, it would have been burnt down or torn down and left in ruins. But for a while after that, there's a bit of a historical gap, so the site might have been abandoned, or maybe there was a small church operating quietly. But this all changed in the 11th century after the Norman conquest. This is when we meet Robert de Stafford, a Norman nobleman who arrived in England with William the Conqueror. Robert was given huge amounts of land as a reward for his loyalty during the conquest, including land in Staffordshire, and he became the first feudal baron of Stafford, and as part of cementing his presence here, he built Stafford Castle, which was originally a wooden fort, which was typical of a Norman move: build a castle, mark your territory, show people who's boss. But Robert didn't stop at military power. He also rebuilt Stone Priory. I mean, this wasn't just about religion. In medieval society, founding or restoring a religious institution gave you status. It showed that you were pious, wealthy, and important. Not just in the eyes of your peers, but in the eyes of the church. And that mattered a lot. Because in those days, people didn't want to just rule while they were alive. They wanted to secure a place in heaven. And the best way to do that, they believed, was through patronage, funding churches, paying for prayers, and making sure that monks were praying for your soul long after you're gone. So Robert de Stafford rebuilding Stone Priory wasn't just a good deed, it was an investment in his name, his family's legacy, and his spiritual afterlife. And over the next couple of centuries, Stone Priory grew in size, wealth, and importance. By the 13th century, it had become the wealthiest religious house in Staffordshire. The priory owned farms that stretched out into the countryside, mills that were vital for grinding grain and making money, pastures for animals, and fish ponds full of carp and pike, and even the rights to churches in other areas, which meant that they collected income from them. One of the biggest moments came on the 13th of July 1251, when King Henry III granted Stone Priory a market charter. Now, this wasn't just a formality. A market charter gave the town a legal right to hold regular markets and annual fairs, which was a massive deal in the medieval world. Markets were the beating heart of a town. They brought in traders, farmers, goods from across the country. And the priory didn't just serve God, it ran the town's economy. Think of it this way. Where there's now a Morrison's supermarket in Stone, there once stood a monastic fish pond, feeding monks who ran what was basically a medieval version of a small business network, with prayer breaks. And these monks weren't locked away chanting all day. They were managing land, producing food, renting property, overseeing tenants, offering charity, and recording local history. And Stone became more than just a quiet religious community. It was a centre of influence, both spiritually and economically. And it wasn't just outsiders who supported the priory. The Stafford family, one of the most powerful noble families in the region, made it their official burial place. This tells you just how important Stone Priory had become, because nobles chose their burial sites carefully. Now, we know about these burials thanks to a source called the Rhymed Chronicle of Stone Priory, which is a poem written in the mid-15th century, which was probably carved originally onto a tablet inside the priory. Now, the tablet itself is long gone, likely destroyed or removed during the dissolution of the monasteries, but before that happened, it was copied down by a man called William Dugdale, who included it in his 1655 book, Monasticon Anglicanum, or some kind of pronunciation like that. The book lists the members of the Stafford family buried at the priory, starting with Robert de Stafford himself and ending with Edmund Stafford, who died in 1403 at the Battle of Shrewsbury. That's over 3 centuries of family history tied to this one site. Imagine what it must have been like to walk through that building at its height. A long nave, stone pillars, stained glass, monks moving through the cloisters, candles burning low, and beneath your feet, generations of one of England's most powerful families laid to rest. You wouldn't just be walking into a church, you'd be walking into a place layered with history, wealth, memory, and politics. And that's what Stone Priory had become. It started with a small church built on grief, but it became a major religious institution backed by royals, nobles, and the church. But as you probably know, even that wouldn't last. Everything that the monks had built, what the families had funded and the people had worshipped in, it was all headed towards a turning point. Because in the 1500s, Henry VIII shows up with some big ideas. And for places like Stone Priory, that meant big trouble. Between 1536 and 1541, nearly every monastery, abbey and priory in England was shut down. Some were looted, some were demolished, some were sold off brick by brick to people with the right connections. Now, Henry's official line was that the monasteries were corrupt, outdated, and too loyal to the Pope. But let's be honest, a big part of it was money. Monasteries were landowners, some of the biggest in the country, and they had centuries worth of gold, silver, land deeds, and rent rolls tucked away in their coffers. And Henry needed cash for wars, politics, and, let's face it, for his lifestyle. So he took it all. And Stone Priory was no exception. Like hundreds of others, it was seized by the Crown, stripped of valuables, and dissolved. And for the monks at Stone Priory, they weren't just praying, they were running schools, caring for the sick, feeding the poor, offering shelter, managing farms. They were part of the community, so when they left, the whole structure disappeared. And the site was sold off, like so many others, to whoever could afford it. That person, at this time, was William Compton. He was a wealthy merchant from Stafford who made his fortune in London. Now, William Compton wasn't a noble, he didn't come from a long aristocratic line, but he was part of a new class rising in Tudor England, which was a wealthy merchant or a self-made man. And for people like William Compton, buying former church land was an opportunity and a sign of status. He likely saw it as a good investment, valuable land, historic buildings, and a location close to the town centre. But it was his son, William Compton II, who really becomes part of the story. Now, William II wasn't just a landowner, he was a public figure. He became Sheriff of Staffordshire in 1598 and served as Justice of the Peace until 1603. Now, that was a powerful role. He oversaw law and order, managing disputes, represented the Crown locally, and it meant that the Compton name was now tied to the county's leadership. He also married very well. He married Jane Aston of Tixall, the daughter of Sir Walter Aston, who was another prominent family. And between them, William and Jane had 14 children. 14. Now, even in the 16th century, that was a lot of kids. I mean, not all of them would have survived to adulthood, but it kind of gives you a sense of the scale of the household and the kind of family legacy that they were building. Now, they were buried in the chancel of the church. That's the space near the altar, which is usually reserved for people of high status. But this is where things get a bit strange. So, remember, by this point, the original medieval priory church was still standing, just about. It had been patched up, repaired, and repurposed over the years, but time wears everything down. Stone cracks, roofs rot, and by the mid-1700s, the church was falling apart. And then, right at the turn of the year, on New Year's Eve 1749, at 12:45 in the morning, part of the church collapsed. The arches and the pillars gave way, making the steeple unsafe. And it must have been a dramatic sight. One moment you've got a centuries-old building, part of the town's history, and the next, rubble, silence, maybe even the sound of bells clanging as they fell. Most of the bells were taken down for safety, and according to the records, one of them was even hung in a tree for a while, just so the town would have something to ring. And the Comptons, well, their tomb, which had been safely inside the church for 150 years, was now outside. And the rest of the building was eventually cleared, and a new church, St. Michael and St. Wolford, was built nearby, using some of the stone from the old priory. But the Comptons' tomb was never moved, so today, if you walk through the churchyard, you can still see the effigies of William Compton II and Jane Aston lying side by side out in the open, and it is rapidly fading away. Stone Priory had been a place of ritual, order, tradition and legacy. There were centuries of noble burials, sacred services and community life. But once the monks were gone, the buildings started to fall, and what was left was just stone. So let's just recap for a moment. We've gone from a royal tragedy in the 7th century, to the rise of a wealthy priory in the Middle Ages, to its dismantling in the 1500s, and the fading of its physical presence by the mid-1700s. And by the time you get to the 18th and 19th centuries, most of Stone Priory is gone. Bits of stone were reused, land was sold, there was a few tombs still visible, but the buildings themselves had disappeared, covered over, or they were forgotten. Or so it seems. Because here's the thing about places with long histories. Even when the surface changes, when you knock things down, rebuild, pave over it all, Some things survive. And in stone, one of those things survived in silence, hidden for centuries under a house. Let me introduce you to number 8, Lichfield Street, Stone. From the outside, it looks like any respectable Georgian house. You've probably walked past houses just like it. It's lovely and symmetrical, brickwork covered in render, sash windows, nice little garden, and at one point it was used as a rectory for housing the priests from the nearby church. Nothing unusual there. But beneath the surface, quite literally, is something remarkable. In the cellar of this house is a rib-vaulted stone undercroft, built in the 13th century. Now this isn't a replica, it's not a reconstruction, it's not a built in the style of feature. This is original medieval architecture, built by the same people who ran and lived in Stone Priory during its wealthiest years. You go down into what looks like an ordinary basement and suddenly you're standing inside a part of a medieval monastery. There are 2 full bays and 2 half bays of rib-vaulted stone ceiling, coursed square stonework, which are carefully shaped blocks laid by skilled hands. And the layout was probably part of the priory's undercroft, maybe used for storage, preparation, or possibly even part of a larger crypt. And it's easy to overlook how rare this is. Most monastic buildings didn't just vanish, they were actively taken apart stone by stone after the dissolution of the monasteries. Some were turned into private houses, others were just abandoned and left to fall into ruin. This seems to have survived because it was absorbed. Not destroyed, but hidden inside something newer. And at some point in the mid-18th century, when the Georgian house was built, the builders decided to incorporate the old undercroft rather than fill it in. Maybe it was convenient, maybe it saved money, maybe they just didn't know what it was. But whatever the reason, the decision meant that there's a piece of 13th century Stone Priory still here today, intact, under a reasonably modern house. That's over 750 years of architectural continuity. Just think about that for a second. People were living in this house, making tea, putting up curtains, storing boxes in the basement, while a rib-vaulted medieval room sat quietly beneath their feet. And it's not a huge chamber, and it's not grand, but it's what makes it so fascinating. It's not a museum piece, it's a survivor. Part of a much larger complex that was left behind when everything else was stripped away. And there's even a section of wall that seems to have been blocked up, which could possibly be a passage to another part of the priory. Maybe a staircase to a deeper level, maybe an extended part of the crypt. We've got no idea what it could have been used for. What is very clear is that it was built with care. The ribs and arches are structurally sound. The materials are typical of the 13th century construction in the region, and the style fits the Gothic period, which dominated English church architecture from the 1200s on. And we often think about medieval buildings as grand cathedrals with towering spires, but just as often they were practical spaces, built to last, yes, but also built to be used. And this room was very clearly used, and it's also a reminder of how much everyday history is hidden in plain sight. Most people in Stone probably don't even know that it's there. You could walk past this house 100 times and never guess that underneath it is a piece of monastic England that has been quietly watching the centuries past. There's no signs, no public plaques, it's not open for tours. It's just there. And how many other places are like this? How many bits of history are hidden under floorboards, bricked into garden walls, or locked away in basements that people never explore? Now we're going to head away from Stone just for a moment, and this part of the story takes us to a field in Surrey, more than 150 miles away. So we're back in the year 2011, and there's 2 metal detectorists, Tony and Veronica Burke, and they're out scanning the ground as they often did. And it's the kind of hobby that involves a lot of waiting, walking, and hoping for that one satisfying beep. And one day, they got one. And what they dug up turned out to be something remarkable. It was a small bronze seal matrix, roughly almond-shaped, slightly worn but still marked. And on the face of the seal was an image. It was the Virgin Mary, seated, holding a palm frond with the infant Christ on a lap. And surrounding the image was a Latin inscription that read, in English, the seal of the Prior of Stone. Now, this wasn't just a decorative object, it was a working tool, used in the 13th century to stamp documents, letters and charters with wax. It would have been pressed into hot wax, leaving behind the official mark of the prior, who was the head of Stone Priory. It would have authenticated religious orders, legal documents, records of land deals, perhaps even the market charter that was granted in 1251. Now, seals were incredibly important in the medieval world. Most people couldn't read or write, so the mark of a seal was the equivalent of a signature. It proved authority, legitimacy, and trust. And here, in a field in southern England in 2011, was the original seal of the Prior of Stone. Now, the Burkes didn't just keep it as a curiosity, they reported the find. Historians got involved, it was studied, verified, and soon began to attract very serious attention. It even made it onto the ITV programme, Britain's Secret Treasures, where it was ranked as the 17th most significant find in the UK that year. But why was it so important? Well, unlike many other monastic seals which were damaged or deliberately defaced during the dissolution of the monasteries, this one survived in absolutely perfect condition, and that's rare. You see, when the monasteries were shut down, the seals were usually clipped or scratched or destroyed, and it was a way of saying that this institution no longer has authority. But this seal escaped that fate, and the big question is how? Why was it found in a field in Cobham, in Surrey, absolutely nowhere near Staffordshire? And there's no official record, but the most likely theory is that at some point during the upheaval in the 1530s, someone took the seal, maybe a monk, maybe a lay person, maybe someone loyal to the priory, and carried it away. Maybe they planned to keep it safe, maybe they were hoping the priory would reopen one day, maybe they just didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands. But whatever the reason, it ended up buried in a field where it stayed for about 500 years, until two people with a hobby and a metal detector just happened to walk across the correct patch of land. After the seal was officially identified and its importance confirmed, the people of Stone were told about it, and they didn't just say, "Oh, that's interesting," they did something about it. The community came together to raise the funds. The local groups, historians, heritage organisations, they pooled the resources to make sure that the seal could come home. And now, this small piece of bronze, made in the 1200s and lost for centuries, is back in Stone, where it belongs. It's not in a vault or behind a paywall, it's displayed locally, accessible, visible, and it's a connection between the town's present and its deep medieval past. And it's not a museum piece, it's a piece of identity, and let's be honest, it's an absolute miracle that it survived. It could have been melted down, broken, lost in a river, stuck in a private collection, misidentified, but instead it was found, restored, and returned to the very community that created it in the first place. And that doesn't happen very often. It is a reminder of how much can be lost, but it's also a reminder of how much can be saved when people care enough to act, because this is what local history is all about. Not just the big dates and the battles, but the small objects, the things that connect us even quietly, a seal, a vault, a name carved into stone. Every once in a while, one of those things comes back to remind us that I was here, this mattered, don't forget. So we've walked through over 1300 years of history. We've gone from a royal family in crisis, to the rise and fall of a powerful medieval priory, to the arrival of merchants, the crumbling of churches, the quiet survival of ancient architecture, and the return of a lost seal that's crossed centuries and counties to find its way home. Stone, Staffordshire. If you don't live there, you might just think of it as another Midlands town. Quiet, functional, few historic buildings, but nothing that would make the front page. But once you know the story, suddenly it looks different. That pub on the corner might be built with stone from a 12th century monastery. That name on a street sign might trace back to a 7th century legend. That basement in a Georgian house might have been walked through by monks 800 years ago. And that's the kind of thing that makes you stop and think, what else have I been walking on that's history? Because if something like that can survive here, in a cellar under a private home, it makes you wonder what's still out there waiting to be found. And that's one of the reasons I love this story, the story of Stone Priory, is because it doesn't just follow a neat timeline. There's no single hero, no tidy ending, just a long, winding journey through time. And that's how most real history works. It's not one big event after another, it's layers. And this is something that I like to talk about quite often. We quite often treat history like something we visit. A museum, a castle, a special place with a ticket price and an audio guide. But the truth is, most history doesn't announce itself. It's buried in car parks, behind shop fronts, in a story that your nan once told you half remembered, in parish records, place names, odd bumps in a field. And when we stop paying attention, we lose those stories. Not in a dramatic way, just slowly, quietly. A stone reused in a wall, a tablet broken up and used as hardcore, a seal lost in a field in Surrey for 500 years. But history has a strange way of holding on. It shows up in unexpected places, and when we're lucky enough to spot it or hear it, we're reminded of something important, that our lives are built on others' lives, and every town has a memory, and that forgetting something isn't always permanent. Sometimes all it takes is a metal detector or a collapsed wall, or someone willing to knock on a cellar door to ask what's underneath. But one of the most powerful things about this story is that the seal came back. Not because a government official ordered it, not because a TV historian made a documentary, but because a community cared enough to raise the money and bring it home. It's easy to assume that history belongs to academics or archives or the experts, but history belongs to all of us, to anyone who's ever wondered why they live, where they live, or why things look the way it does. You don't need a degree to care about your local past. You just need to ask questions, to listen, and to be curious. And that's how these stories survive. That's how they stay rooted in the ground, and in us. And that's history. It's not a straight line, it's not a tidy list of events, it's layers. And sometimes, if you're lucky or paying attention, you get to peel one of those layers back and see what's underneath. And that's what happened in Stone. A town whose name still remembers the stone laid over two boys' graves. A town where monks once ran markets, brewed ale, and managed farms. And a town where a priory vanished, but didn't entirely disappear. Because it's there. Part of it is still there. In walls, in tombs, in basements, and in stories. Every town, every village, and every street corner has layers just like this. Well, thank you very much for listening, guys. Don't forget to subscribe if you've enjoyed this. You can also find my local history videos over on YouTube. Just search for the Red Haired Stokey. And you can also head to my website, which is theredhairedstokey.co.uk, and sign up for my newsletter, which is free, and find out more about local history.